Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation titled Recovering Data and Resuming Business After Ransomware. My name is Andy Fernandez. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard enterprise company. We're going to give everybody just about a minute just so we can all sign on and get comfortable. So in 1 minute, I will jump back on. We'll be ready to go. Thank you. Alrighty, for those who just joined, my name is Andy Fernandez. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard enterprise company. The title of today's webinar is Recovering Data and Resuming Business After Ransomware. This presentation is recorded, so it will be available, not only the actual presentation itself, but the on-demand recording will be available as well for you after. You'll get an email, you'll be able to follow the link, download what you need there. If you have any questions, just log on to the questions tab at the GoToWebinar control panel. And once you do that, just set your question up and I'll make sure that we're able to answer all of these questions at the end, whether I call them out live or I'm able to just submit them in the chat function or email you later with an answer. We'll make sure to get all of your questions answered as well. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time and the opportunity to be here. Let's get started. So today's agenda, we're going to go over kind of an update, right? I think something that we're all aware of, which is the threat, but not only the threat, but the evolution of ransomware attacks on how they are penetrating organizations, how they are damaging not only the reputation, but the financial capabilities that organizations have and how they're evolving and getting even more dangerous and threatening. We're also going to take a look at, as we see ransomware grow, as we see it get even more dangerous, we're not really seeing a change in legacy technology. And when I mean legacy technology, I mean data protection. I don't want to make this conversation today about whether it's looking at your DR or your backup. We're going to talk about today from the perspective of when can you restore data as quickly as possible, get back up and running, and make sure you lose a minimal amount of data. So we're going to go take a look at those challenges. We're going to look at why organizations should look at continuous data protection as that main mechanism in order to recover from ransomware. And we're going to take a look at multiple recovery methods of Zerto from different types of storage and different capabilities that we have. Really, what our value prop is, how the technology works, and what does an actual ransomware recovery with Zerto look like. After that, we'll move forward to questions and answers. So with that, I don't have to spend too much time here talking about the volume and the severity. You know, these are, I have to update this presentation a lot just because there's so many high profile cases that we see publicly. And these are only the ones that we see from a public perspective as well. So we know that this problem is here to stay and it's only growing. And that speaks to the consequences of ransomware as well. Now, if you look at it from a cost perspective, we see the data for 2020 that the estimated cost was $20 billion. This is due not only to its higher impact in the severity of the attacks, but also an 171% increase in the average ransomware payout. It's over 300,000. Now, this data is collected across very, very small organizations, mom and pop shops, but also Fortune 100, Fortune 50 companies. So we know that depending on the size of the organization, these costs could be a lot higher. And that's where it comes to the most important piece, is the average cost of recovery. What does that look like? I'm not talking about the average cost of the ransomware or the ransom for an enterprise, but the actual cost of recovery. Whether you are a financial services institution, a healthcare organization, manufacturing, transport, logistics, no organization can have unnecessary unplanned downtime increases. The goal for all of us is to reduce unplanned downtime. Ransomware is only adding more. And so having that direct service disruption adds to a very high cost. But it doesn't stop there, right? It's not just the service disruption immediately that you see, but it's the amount of hours that your IT team has now dedicated to solve for this. Those are hours that you can't get back when you're trying to actually move forward with revenue building initiatives on the IT side. But then there's also if it's an access to tools where there's a full loss of productivity in your organization. And then you get the qualitative consequences as well, which is reputational damage, especially if you're handling important contracts, important services, and having to be responsible for critical data as well. So I think we're all aware of the severity of this. But one thing to note too is how ransomware has continued to change. We're seeing kind of two approaches here. We have the traditional kind of what I would call ransomware as a service approach, where you have organizations, specifically more individuals, who are buying scripts and kind of just using very common attack vectors and being able to launch high volumes of attacks. So if somebody bites, somebody bites. And we're seeing a lot of that. But then there's the other half, and that is attacks that are of much greater sophistication. Those are the attacks that are usually part of a criminal syndicate, whether it's state-backed, whether it's private. These are organizations that have an R&D department. They have multiple people just explicitly focused on looking at your organization's technical documentation, on evaluating every single presence that you have online. And they're doing these attacks with much greater sophistication, meaning that they're able to understand and target your actual backup so that you have no other means in order to recover. So these attacks usually are also combined attacks, right? So we're seeing an attack kit that has much more than just maybe a traditional malware. So we're seeing attacks from multiple areas, multiple phases. They're much more sophisticated. And we're also seeing kind of a gray area, and from a political perspective, where there's an increased motivation that these attacks are coming from state-backed syndicates and organizations. None of this spells good news for IT managers, for VPs of ITs, or even CEOs of companies, because with this threat, not only is it here to stay, but it's growing in severity as well. Now, that's where, when we're talking today explicitly around data protection, it's not just about when this hits, can I recover this data? That's not the way that we should be looking at things. The way that we need to be looking at things is the before and the after, the full end-to-end continuum of what happens in order to best prepare if an attack happens, and then how to be able to effectively and immediately execute on a recovery plan. And it all starts with having security and best practices planning and training, making sure that this is all documented, that you have specific roles in your organization. Something that we see that's very common is you'll have the CISO and security analysts maybe have a very brief conversation with backup administrators and DR admins, and they'll check the box. But was there an actual test of the backups or of a failover operation in order to be able to do so? And usually the answer is no. And one of the things that we see as well is a lot of these attacks can be traced to bad patching practices or infrequent patching. And ultimately as well, how you configure, harden, and set up your data protection solution is extremely important, that you follow best practices. So these are all things that you have to do effectively in order to make sure that you can even recover in the future. So what happens when that ransomware attack does happen? That moment of encryption hits. Well, it's not just pressing the recovery button, is it? You have to make sure that you have an understanding and of where this data is, what is encrypted, and how you can isolate and contain this threat. Once you're able to isolate, contain this threat, test it for integrity before you're even able to roll back for production, then you can perform your recovery. After you perform your recovery, that comes a cleanup phase. What went wrong? How do we make sure there's no more malware prevalent in the system? So these are all things that need to be taken very seriously. And it's not just saying, I know I have a top recovery solution, we should be fine. That's not the case. This is the only industry where the pace of innovation and the scale of innovation is on the side of a criminal. And so when we think about it from that perspective, we're always playing defense. And we have to make sure that we follow everything meticulously in order to do that. Now, we've talked a lot about the end-to-end continuum, but one thing we're also seeing, though, is that legacy data protection, whether that's backup or DR, is not working. It is not being effective. If these solutions were fit and up to par at the moment, you would see much less costs of these attacks. And why is that? Well, let's make sure we have an understanding here of what we're talking about. When we talk about data protection, there's a lot of what backup DR solutions are able to do around maybe being able to reuse that backup data, being able to use it for detection. And those things are very important. But the core of their use case is, can you help me recover this data? Can you help me get back up and running as quickly as possible? And when it comes to getting back up and running, a lot of these organizations are being failed by their legacy data protection solutions. Think about it. One of the interesting studies that we sponsored, we asked IDC to conduct this study called the State of Data Protection and Disaster Recovery Readiness Report of this year. And within that report, they interviewed over 500 IT pros, whether it was system administrators, backup admins, VPs of IT, directors, and you name it, across different regions, across different types of organizations. And we found some very interesting results. And what we found was that 95.1% of organizations have suffered a ransomware or malware attack in the past 12 months. I think we know this. I think it's not a matter of if, but when, and that's a line that it's almost become cliche to say. But what we saw was that 80% indicated at least one attack that did result in data corruption. 43% experienced unrecoverable data within the past 12 months, and 36% have suffered more than 25 attacks during that time. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the attacks are high in volume, they're successful in actually being able to corrupt data or encrypt it, and we know that legacy backup and DR have been completely inconsistent in not only helping people to effectively recover data, but what this doesn't cover is, how long does it actually take to get that data back? How long does it take to actually recover? And what I mean by that is, let's think about the challenges that we saw. In this same report, we asked, what are your organization's biggest challenges regarding backup and recovery? The first challenge is our backup is not reliable. The second is our backup is expensive. It's out of budget. Our third, which is terrifying in my opinion, is we are not confident in our ability to effectively restore this data first, and also to be able to restore it quickly. And fourth is our backup is very complex to manage. So what we see here is a perfect example of why organizations are struggling to recover from ransomware. And the real reason is they're using solutions that they themselves don't see as reliable. They're expensive, so they might try to cut some corners, and they cannot trust them to get that data back quickly. And they're complex, so there's a lot of administrative overhead to accomplish these things anyways. But those are very high level challenges. We want to talk about the technical challenges as well. And one of the things that I want to mention, right, is if anybody's been in IT or even a photographer for the last 34 years, we are all aware of the 3-2-1 rule. We know that it is imperative to have 3 different copies of data, 2 different types of media, 1 offsite location. These are important things. This is something that we all know, but this hasn't really changed over the years. And there are some specific challenges with the 3-2-1 rule, meaning that it's important to fulfill this rule, but it's just not enough for a modern enterprise. The reason I say this is 3-2-1 was written and interpreted from the perspective of antiquated backup solutions, right? Using VM snapshots to be able to use that data to recover. There's no mention on 3-2-1 really around SLAs. So this is more so is, can we get this data back? It does not address how quickly can we get this data back to be up and running. A lot of it really still talks about offsite tape reliance. We know the challenges. I'm not going to sit on this webinar and just talk about what are the challenges of tape, but I think that the consensus is ideally organizations would like to move to reliable infrastructure in the cloud and on a consumption model. And then the other one is scale as well. How does this affect organizations that are protecting thousands of VMs? What does this look like? How expensive can this be? How fast can we ideally get thousands of VMs back? So we know that there are challenges there on just the construct of 3-2-1, but there's also architectural challenges with legacy data protection. And the number one challenge is VM snapshots. VM snapshots are what affect restore reliability, the speed, and data loss as well. Because as we all know, a VM snapshot produces a serious burden on production environments. And because of that, most organizations are only doing a daily backup. That's something that we've been used to. That's something that has been done in the past. It's been decades old practice. But when it comes to ransomware, if you've invested in cybersecurity tools that allow you to understand exactly the moment of encryption, Even if your backup is reliable and it is working and you're hit at 6 p.m., you've lost an entire day's worth of data. That's an entire day's worth of data lost, even if your solution is working correctly. So VM snapshots, not only do they introduce higher RPO, but they also bring a lot more complexity, right? This is a architecture of, your traditional software agent-based type of backup solution. They require a significant amount of operations to execute on the snapshot itself and move it to a backup repository. Usually this requires dedicated hardware or is an appliance. You're relying on scheduling, on snapshots, agents, server proxies. And we all know that using legacy snapshot backup is not going to be suited for disaster recovery. That is not something that you can use. You have to use replication for DR. And if an organization is still relying on offsite tape backup, then in that scenario, you have to deal with the potential of having lost or damaged tapes. But these are just the high level technical challenges that backup presents. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, I'm going to go over the Zerto technology in a bit. But one thing that I will mention for now is that Zerto, think of the way that Zerto produces data is not a snapshot, it's a replica. It's near synchronous replication that's happening every 5 seconds. A change is being observed. These are RPOs of seconds. That is what we've been doing for the last decade. We provide the fastest recovery, the best RPO. When you think about using periodic backup to recover from ransomware, just what as I mentioned, you're dealing with very high RPOs. You already know you're going to have some level of data loss if you're able to rely on that backup. That's not even accounting for how you can rely on your backup or accounting for how long is it actually going to take me to recover from that daily backup. Now, this is covering RPO. What about RTO? Well, think of the nature of your multi-VM applications. These are applications that have multiple VMs, whether app servers, web, database, you name it. And when you're performing a traditional VM snapshot, that's your backup job, it is done incrementally overnight, meaning that all of the VMs that pertain to this specific application of yours that keeps your business running are being snapshotted at different points in time. This is fine when you're just performing your backup job, but when you actually have to perform that recovery, then you see the challenges. Then you have to do the math, find the common denominator checkpoints, and have serious administrative overhead from your IT team having to be able to do this. It's not always the RPO that really puts a challenge on organizations. It's also the RTO of, we know this is the limit that we have on our data, but it's taking us a very long time to consistently recover these applications. So that's where the RTO comes in, is how do I get operational quickly? And the way to do that is being able to treat your applications as one. If you're dealing with inconsistent recovery, you will not get operational quickly. Now, one thing I do want to mention is we've had examples of organizations who have been attacked by ransomware, have fallen victim to it, and then they start using Zerto software. And then they have another ransomware attack. And we can see very drastically different examples. But this is the example of Tenkata. They are a protective fabrics organization. They are global, and they rely on their manufacturing of protective fabrics to keep in business. And it's very important that there's no stoppage to their manufacturing organization. And they were relying on backup tape and disk. They went through, I believe, a CryptoLocker attack, kind of run of the mill. And they had an immediate 12-hour data loss because they were recovering from their daily backup. But here's the piece that was really a pain point for them. And it was having to spend 2 weeks rebuilding file directories to get that data back, to get up and running back. That was the damage that ruined the weekends, wasted hours and hours of an IT team's time in order to get back up and running. That's not what organizations need, right? If you're any modern enterprise, you cannot afford to spend more than hours, ideally, on resuming operations. So keep this example in mind before we go over the Zerto solution. Now, I've talked a lot, not only about traditional best practices, but what are the shortcomings of legacy data protection, whether it's backup and DR. But what I want to talk to you about now is, once again, getting away from use case silos and just talking about recovery and restore. And what we're going to talk about now is how Zerto can help you do two things. How Zerto can help you resume operations or resume business as quickly as possible and recover data while minimizing data loss. And the way that we do that, and the most important thing at the core of our continuous data protection solution, is our replication. And when I say always on, I mean always replicating. This is near synchronous replication that happens and is using change block or block level replication that allows you to replicate to any site for every 5 seconds. So this means that instead of having one checkpoint a day, you're able to restore to a checkpoint 5 seconds before, 10 seconds before. Really helps you get that granular recovery, thousands of recovery checkpoints a day. Now, a lot of organizations are used to hearing about replication from a storage perspective, right? Recovery point and things like that. This is very different in the sense that, the recover points and other storage companies or storage-based DR solutions are providing array-based replication, meaning you need homogeneous infrastructure on your primary site and on your secondary site. Zerto doesn't need that. We know that organizations have to have flexibility in where they put their infrastructure, whether it's on-premise, public cloud, or a service provider. Zerto is software only and doesn't require agents either. It's a very simple deployment. I can teach any of my friends who are not in tech to easily deploy and learn how to protect with Zerto. But one of the important things that happens as well is, as I mentioned, this is not just VMware to VMware. This is on-premises, public cloud, service provider. This replication does not have any production impact. So as you're replicating, you're not slowing down your production systems and does not require additional hardware, and its storage is not agnostic as well. But what I want to mention that's very, very important is one of my favorite use cases and capabilities that Zerto has. It's one-to-many replication. What I mean by one-to-many is being able to simultaneously replicate locally to production, to the data store, and also replicate to a secondary site at the same time. Think of it as me streaming this webinar to your phone and another phone in a different room that you have. The same data, separate, they're able to use to recover from. We know that ideally when you want to perform local backup or even just a local restore, Zerto allows you to do that using its replication, but then you also have your secondary site for resilience. So if you need to actually perform a failover of that site or a failover of that application, you have that available to you as well. So this is what I would call how we treat tier 1, tier 2 critical applications. What keeps your business running is using this type of replication for your production site and your target site. But we know that these applications are getting more and more important to your business. So what we're seeing is organizations just replicating all of their applications in order to make sure that they get this continuous data protection for backup as well. And one point of this is, being able to have continuous backup, to be able to restore locally. But the other piece is to be able to archive this data and keep it long-term. And that's where long-term retention happens. As I've mentioned, you are replicating locally and you are replicating to a secondary site. And by the way, I'm going to go over all of those ransomware recovery scenarios with the different types of replication. But ultimately, at the same time, while you do this, you want to have daily copies. You want to be able to keep this data, whether for compliance or you want to keep it on immutable storage to be able to have that last resort for ransomware. We allow you to do that. You can just copy this data over to cost-effective storage using the same data point, perform daily, weekly, and monthly copies, and it's incremental as well. And this works on Microsoft Azure, AWS, S3 compatible storage, but also purpose-built backup appliances that you may already have as well. For example, an HPE Store Once or anything similar to that. So I've described a lot here, and I'd rather much show you how not only does our replication help, but how we treat applications, and then get into specific recovery scenarios from ransomware. One thing that I mentioned was thousands of recovery points. right? That's an intimidating thing to hear with somebody who's not used to journaling technology. They're used to having a daily backup, you select that and you recover from that. But what happens if you have thousands of recovery points, 5 seconds apart? It sounds overwhelming. And that's why journaling technology is so important. With Zerto, you simply use the journal to select the point in time that you want to recover. And that allows you to select a specific checkpoint, right? For example, 1558 with 47 seconds. That's the checkpoint you know that has integrity. You've been able to test it, and you know you can recover or restore from that. And within a couple of clicks, you can fail over an entire site or fail over an application. You can recover an application, recover or restore a VM, and instantly recover files as well from local, from secondary, and from long-term retention. This journal gives you one specific environment, one interface to choose from all these thousands of recovery points. So instead of performing hours trying to restore this data, you are doing it in a couple of clicks. Now, I just mentioned hours of recovering data. This is also a crucial component of, it's not just about getting the industry leading RPO, but what about RTO? And as I mentioned before, your traditional backup, even DR solutions that are legacy, don't treat applications consistently. They usually do it at a per VM level. And that's why you're dealing with such lengthy recovery times. With Zerto, we do this completely different. We want to have a simple approach, an application-centric approach. So what you do is you create, when you configure Zerto, a virtual protection group. What this means is you are setting up all of the VMs that pertain to this application as one cohesive unit. So once you start that replication, once you click go, you are now replicating that entire application stack and all of the VMs that belong to it at one single point in time. That's crucial. So when a ransomware attack happens, when you know the data point and the checkpoint that you want to recover, you can easily select it and do it in a couple of clicks, whether that's an entire site or a specific file. That's the ease and simplicity of what Zerto can do. Not just RPO, but getting you back up and running as quickly as possible. And with that in mind, this brings our example of Tenkata. As I mentioned, Tenkata had a traditional crypto locker attack. They suffered 12 hours of data loss, and they spent 2 weeks cleaning up and recovering that data to get operational. Now, after they got Zerto, they replaced their use of backup tape and disk with continuous data protection. So they were using the journal and our replication, kind of a very similar attack. And they only suffered 10 seconds of data loss. They realized what the checkpoint was that was previous to encryption. They selected that, and that recovery took a couple of minutes. Think about that. Being able to have an event that usually is going to give you a lot of data loss, that's going to give you weeks of not focusing on your daily job, and now being able to do it within minutes. That's a crucial aspect, and there's no better example of how Zerto is unique when it comes to being able to recover from ransomware. Now, I talked about our replication, and I talked about our long-term retention. What I want to run through now is our ransomware recovery scenarios. There are multiple ways to recover with Zerto. It's not just one function. So we're going to start locally and get all the way to long-term retention. So think, as I mentioned, local. We already have one-to-many replication. So under this assumption that you've configured it this way, you are replicating locally to data store. This is production hot storage. And at the same time, you are replicating to a secondary site. But for example, whether it's a data corruption, whether it's a deletion, or even an encryption at the file, folder, VM level, you're able to immediately restore a VM. Immediately. This also applies to being able to immediately restore a file or a folder. Think of the speed that provides, being able to do it from local with no production impact with RPOs of seconds. This takes a lot of the operational recoveries that you had. Whether it's you're using DR or backup, this takes that first 2 weeks of how that data is produced and makes it very simple for you to be able to restore instantly. But as we know, there always are going to be DR scenarios. Whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a larger scale ransomware attack, that's when you want to use that warm site, that secondary site. Doesn't matter if it's on premise, on public cloud, or a service provider. you can recover, and by recover I mean fail over an entire application or an entire data center and site in the same amount of clicks it took you to restore file. So that shows you the ability to have multiple tiers, different types of attack, try to encrypt at different levels and have different levels of sophistication. So you want to have multiple tiers that you're able to recover from different data sets as well. So we talked about continuous backup here with local and with replication to a secondary site. But sometimes attacks take a little longer. They're detonated a lot longer, and then you have to deal with being able to recover from a copy of that data. And that's where Zerto's long-term retention comes in. The fact that this data is copied daily and into immutable long-term retention with AWS gives you the ability to also have that final tier of recovery that you can have, especially when you know maybe there's something has happened, we don't know how deep they're in our system, we just want to recover from data that has not been changed and is using worm, then this is a way that you're able to do so. The beauty of this architecture, though, is these are all things that are happening simultaneously within the Zerto Virtual Manager. This is one interface where you can perform all these recoveries in the exact same amount of time, the exact same amount of clicks that you're taking as well. And one thing that I do want to mention is how important it is to have immutability. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of organizations, and by organizations, I mean criminal syndicates, are getting very good at seeing which organizations haven't configured their backup correctly and even altering that backup data so it can't be recovered. That's why having immutable backups is so important. And with Zerto 9, we introduced immutable backups for AWS, where you can configure retention sets to safeguard that backup data so it can't be deleted, can't be altered, and it's using AWS object lock. And as I mentioned, it's a worm model. So it's really important to make sure you have all these tiers that make sure not only can I recover quickly, but also I have that last defense to be able to use as well. Now, it's not just the recovery aspect as well. There's a lot of critical things that have to happen for an organization to be resilient. And one of those things is testing. Whenever we talk to customers, even partners who talk to customers, one of the things that come up is organizations are not testing their data as much as they should be. Whether it's failover testing or whether it's backup testing, they're not able to do so because they don't have an environment. They don't have an isolated environment free of consequences that they can perform this. So that's where the Zerto On-Demand Sandbox comes in, where it's replicating and protecting your production environment. This is a separate place where you can initiate a test workflow on those applications or the servers where you create the sandbox. And then with this sandbox, you can use it for patch testing, vulnerability scanning, analytics, forensics, and more. So that's where the testing comes in. With this isolated network or sandbox, you have automated failover testing. We have organizations and case studies that were spending days or even a week on DR testing. With Zerto, that testing is immediate and allows you to also get automated testing reports to understand what is your RPO status? Did this go well? Let's identify any anomalies. And if you do see something that went wrong, test again. Zerto allows you to do that. It allows you to do that on the backup side as well. We know organizations only maybe test 1-2% of their backups. With Zerto, you can change that. And ultimately, you don't want to have to buy additional analytics tool in order to monitor your environment. You want to have one place where you protect that data, where you test that data, but where you can also visualize that data. And that's where Zerto Analytics, which is software you can access from anywhere, has a live network history and RPO live history as well. So you can monitor network performance, IOPS, you can identify these anomalies and zoom in to troubleshoot as well. And you can dive down to the VM level as well. And whether it's even pre-attack, you can monitor those SLAs and make sure that you see and identify whether something's going wrong in your network. So it's really important to have that. So I said a lot today, but if I could summarize why Zerto is special for ransomware, why it helps you be resilient as an organization, meaning being able to get back up and running quickly, but also being able to recover the most amount of data as possible. It's because it's all based on continuous data protection. Always on replication with journaling technology that's simple, easy to use, and gives you thousands of recovery points a day, not just one daily backup. The workflows are extremely important. The fact that you can fail over in a couple of clicks, but also do a file level or an instant file recovery in a couple of clicks is extremely important. Saves a lot of time, reduces administrative overhead. And testing is just as important. If you have a great solution and you've never tested it, you don't want to, for the first time, to see how it works is with ransomware. That's not something that an organization should be doing at any scale. And ultimately, the analytics and compliance reporting. The ability that not only can you test whenever you want, but you get automated reporting is crucial. So with that, I want to leave you with some more resources. Instead of just listening to what I said, what you can actually do is see it for yourself, right? See what I've mentioned, the types of recovery, find out how you can do them yourself. And you can test drive this on the ransomware side as well, or just backup. But you can test drive with using zerto.com/labs, and you can see a full encryption and then see how you're able to restore or recover from that encryption. And that'll give you a step-by-step. And it, to me, is the best way to be able to visualize why Zerto is special when it comes to a ransomware attack. The other piece I want to mention too is sometimes you'll get other members of your organization who might not have a time to deploy a lab, but they do want to get some more information, whether it's at the executive level or at the technical level. And that's why I urge you to download the Cyber Attack Survival Kit as well with the link there. Once we send out this recording and the presentation, you'll be able to have that link as well. So with that, I'm going to take a look at a couple of the questions that we have here, and we'll go from there. So one of the questions I had is, how effective is continuous data protection, journaling, and immutability? Continuous data protection is extremely important. And Larry, this is a great question. Continuous data protection is important. It's what we've developed for over a decade, and it's what organizations, whether airlines, manufacturing, financial institutions, trust the most. Because of the gaps that they've had with not being able to restore or recover from a daily backup, having that replication is extremely effective. But also copying that data onto immutable storage is extremely important as well, because you never know what happens to certain environments, and you always want to make sure that you have an unaltered data set that you can recover from as well. Can I just, so another question was, can I just have the LTR and not the secondary site? Yes, you can. There's a way to consume that where you're simply using Zerto to be able to archive this data, have it in long-term retention. But what I will say is I treat that as an important aspect of the Zerto product, but you'd be doing a disservice not using the replication. The replication is what's going to give you the ability to resume immediately, especially for anything that happens within 2 weeks or up to 30 days. And then having the ability to retain this data in LTR is important. But if you're interested in that, then yes, you're able to just use the LTR as well. Another great question, Larry, is how can it be determined which recovery point to use? There's a few ways. One way is what we always do is we recommend that organizations have malware detection, not malware detection that was, a externality of a backup product, but malware detection that is purpose-built, because it allows you to understand explicitly at what point is a checkpoint encrypted. But something that we also offer is you can isolate this data. So you pick a checkpoint that you think is okay, isolate it, realize that there is malware and you shouldn't be able to use this, then you go back and go previous. So we'll see that organizations maybe try to immediately restore to 10 seconds. They realize that that has malware or it's been encrypted. So they restore a minute before or a minute and 30 seconds before. And that gives you the flexibility to not only reduce data loss, but also make sure that that data has integrity. So Zerto works on what VM platforms? From a hypervisor level, Zerto works with vSphere and Hyper-V, and that's on whatever storage you want. As long as you have any of those two hypervisors, and you can use any type of infrastructure that you want, and that also applies to public cloud infrastructure, Azure or AWS as well. So, okay, here's another really important question by Brian. Brian mentioned, I've heard that sometimes ransomware will encrypt data, but do so for many days before killing access and sending the ransom notice. That happens, replicated data, backups may be encrypted, wouldn't it? This seems to be glossed over by many ransomware mitigation schemes. And how does Zerto protect against such long-term encrypted files? That's a really important point. That's a point that I want to mention because not all attacks are the same. You're going to get a high volume of crypto locker level attacks, very low level attacks that essentially allow you to immediately restore. They're not encrypting anything. But then there are attacks where they detonate much longer and you don't know what you can trust. And that's why we always recommend having that data copied on immutable storage so that you know that that is a piece that you can trust immediately. Another question is by Gary, when will immutable backups be available for Azure? With the information that I have now, and this is subject to change, it will be in our next major release, but the moment I have more information for that, I will send that over to you. Going through a few more, there's going to be a lot of questions here, so if I'm not able to get to yours, I will make sure that we do have a response for you. Going through a few more of these. Is Zerto supported for physical? No, Zerto, we support virtual applications, SaaS applications, and containerized applications, not physical. So what I'm seeing is I'm still getting a stream of more questions. And before just keeping everybody on here for several more minutes, I will reach out to each of you individually with an answer and with more resources. But with that in mind, I want to thank you so much for your time. I want to thank you for your attention. And I will send over this presentation, the recording, and I'm very happy you're here. Thank you and have a great day.